The water reached her chin at the second hour, and Thora stopped counting. She'd been keeping track of time the way she always did when panic was trying to get in. Something to measure, something to focus on, the tide rising at the rate she knew it would, because she'd grown up in the Saltmere marshes, and she understood this land better than anyone who had ever bothered to look at her. The storm had pushed the surge higher than usual, a foot above the normal line, maybe 18 inches. She'd calculated the differential with the same quiet precision she used for herb measurements, for dosing charts, for the land grant records she'd transcribed in the Saltmere packhouse basement for 9 years. The calculations hadn't helped. The iron snare around her left ankle had been set in the marsh grass 2 weeks ago, during the border dispute with the Holofen wolves, and no one had gone back to pull them. Probably no one had remembered. She hadn't remembered either, not until her left foot punched through the grass, and the jaws clamped shut with a sound like a gunshot, and the pain was so immediate and complete that she had nearly dropped Seren. She hadn't dropped Seren. The baby was 17 days old and had been crying for the first hour. She'd gone quiet in the second, which was more frightening than the crying. Thora held her above the waterline with both arms locked at the elbows, her shoulders burning past muscle into something deeper. Her fingers were losing sensation. She registered this at a clinical distance, the way you notice something happening to someone else's body. She'd always had cold hands. The Saltmere wolves had said it was because she didn't run warm the way real shifters did. She was a real shifter, she just couldn't prove it. Her wolf, the part of her that should have emerged when she was 13, that should have howled its first time under the moon with the rest of her birth year, lived somewhere inside her chest behind a door she had never been able to open. She could feel it. A pressure like something pressing its nose against the back of her sternum from the inside. There but silent, always silent. The water rose another half-inch. She thought about her sister Brenna, and then she stopped, because grief was not useful, and Brenna would have told her to focus. Brenna had died 16 days ago, 40 hours after Seren was born, in the way that some women die. Quietly and quickly and with very little warning, her body simply stopping the way a clock stops. The pack healer explained it in clinical terms. Thora held Brenna's hand through all of it, and then she held the baby, and then she sat on the floor of her room for 2 hours, and when she got up, she was a mother. No one had asked her. It wasn't that kind of thing, with the father long gone and Brenna's name already being quietly removed from the supply rosters. The pack's handling of Thora herself had been subtler. Not openly hostile, hostility required acknowledgement, and acknowledging Thora had never been Saltmere's habit. Her gathering assignment shifted to the newest apprentice. Her supply access code stopped working. The healer's records she'd been transcribing for 9 years were boxed and moved to a shelf she wasn't invited to reach. One morning she arrived at the communal kitchen with Seren in a sling and her meal chit, and the wolf behind the counter looked straight through her like she was a window. She'd left that night with 1 pack of dried herbs, a blanket for the baby, and boots that were already splitting at the soles. She'd been trying to reach the old coast road. The marsh had other ideas. "I know," she said to Seren, because the habit of talking to her was already set in place. Her voice was swallowed immediately by the wind, which was doing something structural overhead, bending the marsh grass nearly horizontal. "I'm working on it." She wasn't working on it. The snare was old iron, with a spring mechanism she couldn't reach with her hands above her head, and her ankle locked 6 inches below the waterline. She'd tried the first 20 minutes. She'd torn 3 fingernails down to the quick on the mechanism's edge. The blood had floated off in a thin ribbon on the current. The water reached her chin. She thought, "I am going to die here, and Seren has to be set on a piece of high ground and hope that someone finds her before the surge does." She had already decided. The decision had been made the moment she'd picked Seren up in that blood smell room 3 days ago from a sister who would never open her eyes again. Everything was for the baby now, everything her body had left to give. Then she heard it. Not footsteps, a sound moving through the wind that her broken, silenced wolf recognized before she did. A howl, low and so deep it was almost below hearing, something she felt more than heard, vibrating against the door her wolf pressed behind. The dark shape came out of the rain 30 feet away. It was enormous. She registered that first, the sheer size, the black fur that was nearly invisible in the dark except where the lightning caught it, and showed the depth of it, the layers, the way a storm sky looks black until you see the blue inside it. Eyes burning amber, like something inside the skull was on fire. It stopped at the edge of the standing water, and its nose dropped to the surface, and it stood completely still. Then it shifted. The man who stepped out of the transition was built like the cliff she'd been trying to reach, broad and absolute, and clearly not interested in the concept of obstacles. He was also bare, which was standard for an unexpected shift, and she noticed this only because her brain was cataloguing details with the frantic thoroughness of a mind that understood it was close to the end. He crossed the water without hesitation. He was steaming in the rain, wolf metabolism burning full, and the heat came off him in waves she felt on her face before he reached her. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Let me take her," he said. "No," Thora said. Her voice came out flat and even, which wasn't what she'd intended, but her body had its own plan for this conversation. He didn't argue. He knelt in the chest-deep water and reached beneath the surface for the snare, and she heard metal groan. And then she heard it snap, clean and decisive, like he was breaking something that had never deserved to hold, and the pressure on her ankle released. The pain that replaced it was extraordinary and immediate, and she made a sound she wasn't proud of. "I've got you," he said. "You don't," she said, but she let him take Seren with one arm and wrap the other around her ribcage, and she held his shoulder with her free hand and did not think about how warm he was, how solid, how completely unlike anything she'd had access to in a very long time. "Dante," he said, "Alpha of Tidewarden." She knew who he was. She'd filed 3 border agreements with Tidewarden in the last 4 years. "Thora," she said, "I'm no one's problem." He said nothing to that. He carried them both out of the marsh. The Tidewarden fortress was carved into the cliffside, warmed by vents from somewhere below that carried mineral heat, like standing over a hot spring. The corridors smelled like old stone and beeswax and salt cedar, and Thora would later realize that the scent was just the place itself, the way the cliff breathed. The pack healer, a compact woman named Nara, who moved with the economy of someone who had formed no opinions about any injury she'd ever seen, splintered Thora's ankle with the efficiency of someone who found bone reassembly more interesting than conversation. 2 places fractured. The assessment was delivered the way weather is delivered, factually, without commentary. Seren was declared aggressively healthy for an infant carried through a hurricane and handed to a young pack member who stood with her arms extended like she was presenting the baby to a deity. "She makes a sound like a seagull right before she's hungry," Thora said from the table. "Don't wait for the seagull sound. She's already angry by then." The young wolf looked at the baby with recalibrated expectations. Dante did not leave the room. Thora noticed. She noticed he stood at the head of the table and did not hover, did not crowd, did not touch her again after setting her down. He stood like a man who intended to be there and was waiting to see if he'd be tolerated. She tolerated it. She was too tired for anything else. On the second day, Nara sat down beside her with the look of someone who had found something unexpected and was deciding how to say it. "Your wolf," Nara said. "It's been sealed. Old pack magic, the kind that requires an alpha's authority and a significant expenditure of power. Deliberate, done to you when you were a child. This was not natural, not a condition you were born with. Someone chose to do this. Thora sat with that. She thought about being 13, standing in the Saltmere clearing while every other wolf in her birth year broke open and howled their first time under the moon. She had stood among them and felt the pressure in her chest flare brightly for one wild second before it was immediately cleanly extinguished, like a candle pinched between two wet fingers. Alpha Merrick had been standing at the tree line. She'd looked at him, he'd looked away. She had read that look as disgust for a decade. "Can you break it?" she asked. "Not yet. You need to be stronger first." Dante appeared in the doorway. She was already learning to recognize the particular quality of stillness that preceded him, and from the set of his jaw she understood he'd heard everything. "Who did this?" he said, not a question. "I think I know," she said, "and I don't have the full answer yet. Don't." Something moved through his face, the controlled impulse of a man overriding something that wanted badly to act. And then he nodded once. He brought breakfast in the morning. He always asked before holding Seren. He kept his distance in the corridors, close enough that she felt his warmth, far enough that she never felt crowded, and she understood this was deliberate, that it cost him something. She could feel the bond. She'd heard about mate bonds in the abstract, the way you hear about things that happen to other people. This was not abstract. It was a thread of warmth in her chest that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, which she could hear through walls, through stone, through the cliff itself. She did not examine this too closely. She filed it next to the other facts of her new life and moved forward. On the 8th day, Dante's half-brother arrived. Idris was tall and blade-sharp, and the kind of handsome that was increasingly complicated up close. He sat across from her in the library with the look of someone doing math they find unfavorable. "I have spent 3 years building an alliance between Tidewarden and the Southern Coast Packs," he said. "That alliance requires Dante to mate with Councillor Voss's daughter. This was understood, arranged, and then you come out of the marshes and the bond happens and everything I've built is at risk because of biological coincidence." Thora looked at him, at the whiteness of his knuckles where his hands gripped the table edge. "I'm not trying to disrupt anything," she said. "I've been planning to leave." Something crossed his face that was not relief. The opposite. As if her agreement had removed the shape of a conflict, he needed to make sense of what he was actually feeling. He left without a clear victory, which seemed to bother him more than a loss would have. She found Dante in his study that afternoon. He was at the window, looking at the sea, still as something carved, and she told him she was leaving. His brother was right. She was a complication he didn't need. He turned, and the look on his face made her want to take a step back, not from fear but from the simple force of being fully seen by someone who didn't look away. "Idris is operating under a plan I never agreed to," he said. "I was informed, not consulted." He crossed the room slowly until he was close enough that she could smell the storm scent of him, pine salt and cold air. "Can I tell you something I've told no one?" She waited. "I have watched every mated pair in this pack for 11 years and tried to understand what they had that I didn't. My wolf has never been still. He has never trusted anyone. Not once in 11 years. He stopped. His hands, she noticed, were shaking at his sides, and she watched him become aware of this and fail to make it stop. "I was running the storm boundary and caught your scent through the rain. Salt and cedar smoke and green things growing in salt water, and every thought in my head just stopped. My wolf went completely quiet, the first time in 11 years, the only time. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. If you leave, you take the only silence I've ever had, and I will never have it again." Thora pressed her hand to her chest. Against her palm, the sealed thing moved. Not a flutter, a roll, a turning, something surfacing from deep water. "It's moving," she whispered. "The bond is feeding your wolf. She's been starving behind that seal for 20 years, and the bond is giving her something to drink." She stood very still and felt her own wolf push against the inside of her ribs with a testing, deliberate force she had never once felt before. Something enormous, something that knew exactly how long it had been waiting. "I'm afraid," she said. "I know. Not of you, of wanting something and having it taken. That's been the whole shape of my life. I can't do it again, not with Seren. Not with—" She stopped. "Then let me give you one small want," he said. "Stay today. Tomorrow I'll ask again. You can say no, one day at a time, until you're ready to want more." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She looked at his trembling hands, and she put her hand over one of them and felt the shaking slow under her palm. That was enough for both of them. The council wolves came on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong to her afterward. Attacks should have weather appropriate to them, not just a regular grey morning turned quietly violent. Seren woke her at 2 a.m. with a cry that was wrong, the pitch of it jagged in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Thora was on her feet before her eyes opened. She had the baby against her chest and her back to the wall in the time it took her to identify what she was smelling. Something chemical and synthetic layered beneath wolf scent, bitter under the salt air, the enhanced kind, council enforcers. 3 of them came through the window. They moved in formation, their eyes carrying the green tint of chemical modification, cutting off the exits with the coordination of people who had done this before. The first one reached for Seren. The seal broke. She didn't decide. It broke the way ice breaks when the force exceeds what can be held, not a choice, a threshold. She felt every binding thread of old pack magic snap inside her chest, and what came up from beneath it was not a shift, not light. It was her voice. Her real voice, the one that had been locked away since she was 13. It came out of her throat as a single sustained note that she had no word for. Not a command, not a sound in the ordinary sense, something closer to what lives at the bottom of the ocean and moves the water above it for miles without anyone on the surface knowing why. The 3 wolves stopped. They didn't fall. They stood in the center of the room, and the tone moved through them, and she could see it happening. The chemical modifications the council had threaded through their wolves, burning out the way impurities burn out of heated metal, and beneath the burning, their real wolves surfacing, shaking off something that had been holding them under for years. One of them sat down on the floor and pressed both hands over his face. Dante came through the adjoining door. She heard the lock mechanism give before she registered the sound of him, and then he was in the room, dark fur rippling across his shoulders, amber eyes burning, hands that could split stone, and he stopped. He looked at her. She was standing in the middle of the room with a 17-day-old baby pressed to her chest, and her eyes were doing something she could feel but not see, and the 3 council wolves were on their knees. The air tasted like the ocean 200 feet below at high tide. "I couldn't stop it," she said. "Don't stop it." He crossed the room through whatever she was radiating, and his wolf, which had never, she would later learn, bowed its neck to anything, lowered as he walked toward her, the way that old wolves bow to water. He reached her and put his hand on her face. "Breathe." She breathed. Seren, against her chest, made the seagull sound. Under the circumstances, it was the most grounding thing that had happened in the last 2 hours. One of the council wolves looked up. His eyes were his own again. The green gone, something clear and startled in its place. "We were sent by the Coastal Council," he said. "They were informed a tide caller had emerged and bonded the Tide Warden Alpha. There are 12 more coming. Dawn." Dante said 3 words to Ferren, who had appeared in the doorway with guards. The words were, "Call them in." By the time the first grey light reached the water, Tide Warden's walls held 200 wolves. The Ironcliff pack arrived from the north in the dark, 80 wolves strong. Their alpha, a weathered woman named Dwayne, who had a personal history with the council that predated this by a decade. and who had answered Ferren's message with a single word before mobilizing. From the south came the Ridgeback pack, 120 wolves, their alpha an older man who owed Dante a debt from a border skirmish, and who had been waiting, by the look of him, for something like this. The 12 council wolves arrived to find 300 wolves looking down from the walls. Their commander shifted to human form in the grey dawn and raised his hands. Dante's voice carried the full weight of Alpha command from the battlements. The Tidecaller is the bonded mate of the Alpha of Tidewarden. She is under my protection and the protection of every pack on these walls. You are welcome to come and take her. All of you, together, come and take her, and I will show you what I am willing to do for the people in my care. The commander looked at the walls. He made a calculation. He left. Merrick was in the southern guest quarters, where he had arrived 2 days earlier, and asked for an audience Thora hadn't known about. He was older than she remembered. He'd always seemed immovable the way stone did, but the man standing in the center of the room was carrying something heavy and had been for a long time, and it showed. Your mother came to Saltmere when you were 3, he said. She was dying. She'd been running for 2 years from the council's hunters, and she was out of road. He paused. Her name was Alice. She was the last Tidecaller I knew of. She gave you to me, and she died 3 days later, and I buried her in the salt meadow and told no one what she was. Thora's hands tightened on Seren. When you turned 13, your wolf began to come in, and I could feel the resonance in it, the scope of it. If one other Alpha in the region had sensed it, the council would have come. They would have killed you and burned Saltmere flat. He stopped. His jaw worked. I placed the seal to protect you. I made you invisible to keep you alive. He met her eyes. I didn't think clearly about what invisible would cost. The room was quiet. You let it happen, Thora said. The erasure, the scars that weren't your hands but were your inaction. She held his gaze. I understand the logic. I don't forgive the outcome, but I understand the logic. That's more than I deserve. Yes, she said, it is. He left. Dante moved to stand beside her, close but not touching, and waited. I'm not crying, she said. Okay, he said. I might cry later, when there isn't a political crisis and a baby to feed and a council to. Okay, he said again quietly. She leaned into him sideways, just her shoulder against his arm. He didn't move. He was very warm. She was beginning to understand that he would always be this warm, this present, this steady, that it was simply a feature of him, like the amber eyes and the hands that had snapped iron apart in a flooded marsh and then set a newborn down with the particular care as of someone who understood exactly how breakable small things were. Idris left Tidewarden 3 days later without goodbye. She heard months afterward that he'd gone to the southern coast packs and offered his legal mind to the council negotiations that Dante's alliance had complicated, and that he was brilliant at it, the kind of brilliant that emerges when a person stops trying to be something they weren't built for. She heard this and felt something that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't peace, but lived in the space between them, which was sufficient. The marking ceremony was held at the cliff's edge under the full moon, with the sea 200 feet below and the salt wind coming off the water in long, clean sweeps. Nara had insisted on wool over silk. Silk, she said, was a foolish choice for a cliff in November. Thora's hair, washed clean in warm water for the first time, had turned out to be not the dark muddy brown she'd always assumed, but a deep amber red that caught the moonlight and seemed to generate its own. Dante stood before her and said her name to the assembled pack, and the sound of it in his voice did something to the air. Thora, I claim you as my mate, my Luna, my equal, not by authority, not by accident, by choice, mine and yours both. He tilted his head back, baring his throat. The most powerful Alpha on the coast, offering his most vulnerable point to a woman who had spent 20 years being told she had no voice worth hearing. She stepped forward and put her hand over his pulse, and felt it beat against her palm, fast and strong, and then she tilted her own head, and he lowered his mouth to the curve of her neck, and when his teeth broke her skin, the pain was brief and vivid, and gave way immediately to something else. Warmth moving outward from the mark in every direction, through her blood and her bones, and the bond between them, which had been a thread and then a current, became something with no adequate word for its size. She bit him back. He tasted like salt and cedar and the clean cold of deep water. The mark on his throat glowed silver before it settled. Her wolf, fully unbound and awake for the first time in 20 years, rose inside her chest and opened her mouth. The sound that came out of Thora was not human and not animal, but something older than both, and it went out over the cliff edge and over the ocean below, and the water responded. Just a shift in the surface, just a change in how the waves broke against the base of the cliff, but the pack heard it and felt it, and threw back their heads and answered. 200 wolves howling for their Luna. Seren, held by Ferren at the back of the circle, opened her eyes at the sound. In the moonlight, they were the blue-black of deep ocean, not the pale, uncertain blue of a newborn's unfixed gaze, but something already specific, already certain, already entirely her own. Ferren looked at those eyes and then looked at Dante, and then looked back at the baby, with the expression of a man recalibrating several assumptions simultaneously. Spring came late to the coast, but when it came fully. Green pushing through cliff crevices, the salt meadows going gold and purple with the first wildflowers, the sea shedding its winter grey, and finding the bright blue-green that only appeared when the light changed and the water remembered what it was. Thora was sitting at the cliff's edge in the morning light, Seren in her lap, watching the seals on the rocks below. The baby was 7 months old now, and had strong opinions about everything, particularly the seals, whom she regarded with an intensity of focus that made Thora think, privately, that Seren would have things to say to the sea when she was old enough to say them. Dante came up behind her and sat on the stone at her back, close, his warmth settling over her like weather. His hand rested on her shoulder, not heavy, just present, the particular weight of someone who intended to remain. She had been learning what she could do with the Tidecaller gift, now that it was fully hers. Some of it was still frightening. Most of it was extraordinary. All of it was hers in a way that nothing had ever been before. Not borrowed, not conditional, not subject to anyone else's decision about whether she deserved to keep it. Seren grabbed her mother's braid and pulled with the focused commitment of a child who had decided this was important. Thora untangled the small fist gently and kissed the small fingers. Seren looked up at her with those deep water eyes and made the sound that meant the morning was acceptable, that this moment was approved. Dante's hand tightened on her shoulder. The bond between them hummed low and steady and warm, the way the sea sounded below the cliff on a calm day, not silent, not loud, just continuous, just there, the sound of something that had always been present and simply needed her to stop moving long enough to hear it. She leaned back against him. The spring light caught the marks on both their throats, the silver scars already the same color as the inside of a wave. Below them, the ocean moved the way it always moved, patient and enormous, carrying everything that fell into it forward, not holding and not losing, just bringing it along toward whatever shore came next.